History is not a long line of separate bricks put together in the way a bricklayer builds a wall. History is more like a river, and as the Greek philosopher Heraclitus observed, we cannot step twice into the same river. The river moves on, and even if we try to move along the bank with it while we look to find a way of repeating our first step into it, we change as well. All very profound and not really what we're meant to be studying tonight. But my point is that there's no single date or event where we can say that the Old Testament is finished and, after a specific number of years, the new begins. Of course, theologically, the Old Testament era ended at the cross, and the new begins with the resurrection. And while these are both historical events that changed the course of human history, it's not really the type of history we're concerned with in these classes. As we have looked at the close of the recorded history of the Jewish people over the past 3 weeks, we've seen the changes that occurred in the practice of the Jewish religion after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 586 BC. Judaism had to adapt to survive. And while God remained in control of his world, sometimes the people of God struggled to understand what was happening and why. We can date the end of the Babylonian kingdom, or Neo-Babylonia to be pedantic, to the 12th of October 539 BC, when the Persian army of Cyrus the Great, king of the Medes and the Persians, entered the city of Babylon. This decisive event was several years in the making, going back to 550 BC, when Cyrus led his outnumbered Persians in a victory over the Median army. In the words of F.F. Bruce, Cyrus immediately displayed the qualities of a statesman as well as those of a military commander. Instead of imposing Persian rule on the Medes, he had himself crowned as king of Media and ruled the two nations as a united monarchy with each part enjoying equal rights. Hence the Medes and the Persians, which we read about in the later books of the Old Testament. And this uniting of the two kingdoms in 550 led to the inevitable defeat of their southern neighbour of Babylon 11 years later in 539. If we remember that Babylon taught the people of Judah a lesson, it was Persia that brought this punishment to an end when the time was right. It was the capture of Babylon that first brought Persia to the attention of the Jewish people. Those living in and around the city of Babylon now found themselves living under a new ruler. And although they probably did not know about it immediately, the Jews of Jerusalem were in the same situation. Those Jews that remembered what the prophet Isaiah had said may not have been taken completely by surprise. Cyrus is named several times in the book of the prophet Isaiah, in chapter 45, for example. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. This may well raise a question for some readers, one that deserves a full answer, but not in this class. Isaiah ministered through the reigns of 4 kings of Judah. As Jim McGuigan explains, he, Isaiah, had lived through the prosperous times of Uzziah and Jotham when the nation was militarily strong. He experienced the decline under Ahaz, with the civil war, the alliance with Assyria, and the terrible financial burden of that alliance. He prophesied through the seesaw days of Hezekiah and learned from experience and revelation that trust in the Holy One of Israel was the needed human response. And he shared that experience and that message with countless millions. You do not need to remember the dates I'm about to reel off. You can look them up later if you need them. Jotham reigned from 740 to 732. We count backwards BC, remember. Then came Ahaz, 732 to 716. Hezekiah was 716 to 687. Cyrus the Great reigned over the Medes and the Persians from 539 to 530, still BC. So how could Isaiah in the 700s BC know about Cyrus, who was to come about 200 years later? Good question. What is at issue is whether God can tell his servants what's going to happen. Is predictive prophecy possible? In human terms, no, or at least only up to a point. When, in the 1930s, Winston Churchill warned the British people to prepare for war with Germany, he was making a realistic assessment of the situation and making a prediction that, sadly, came true when Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Was Churchill a prophet? Not in the biblical sense. He was an intelligent politician with a knowledge of history and made a prediction that indeed came true. If God, in his wisdom, tells a prophet what is to happen, then we expect it to happen indeed. Although we should note that sometimes God's predictions were conditional. Note the use of that big word, if. If you fear God and keep his commands, you will live long and prosper. But if you do not keep his commands, then the Lord will withdraw his favor and you will suffer. Remember how Jonah did not want to take God's warnings to Nineveh because he knew that the Assyrians would listen and God would spare them. Of course, if God is God in any meaningful sense of the word, he dwells above and beyond the constraints of time. We remember the past, sometimes not very clearly, and can only guess at the future. But God is. God sees past, present, and future as a single eternity. Or at least that's how I understand the matter. Not that I can claim to fully understand God. All I can see is whatever he graciously chooses to show me. But I believe that the God of the Bible is above and beyond time and can tell his servants, the prophets, whatever he knows they need to hear. However, Bible readers who have a different understanding of the nature of God will have to understand prophecy differently. It is important to say that much, actually better say most, Old Testament prophecy was directed at the original audience of the prophet. He or she knew that the people needed a clearer understanding of their God and delivered the message that the people of that time needed to hear. Only later did the prophet or one of his disciples make a written record so that future generations could read and benefit from the message the prophet delivered to meet a particular need at a particular time and in a particular place. Only by being written down could these messages become universal. Bible readers who do not believe in a God who can tell his servants what's going to happen many years in the future have to interpret predictive prophecy in a different way. The usual approach is to speculate that the disciples of the original prophet would gather together to study his message. Some came to be acknowledged as knowing their master better than his other disciples. Perhaps they had followed him longer, or had a better memory, or just got him better than others. I remember some of my own teachers, men such as Alec Allen, Albert Winstanley, and Frank Worgan, who would illustrate their teaching with memories of their own teacher, Walter Crosswaite, so that I felt as though I knew old brother Crosswaite, as they called him, even though Walter died before I'd reached my first birthday. Not that I'm suggesting, perish the thought, that Walter Crosswaite was a prophet. I'm using him as an example of how one person's teaching can be kept alive for future generations by those he taught. And now I'm telling you about him too. So back to Isaiah and his disciples. And a man with a message such as Isaiah's must have had some followers during his lifetime. They remembered what he taught them, and eventually someone made a written record or collected together what the prophet himself had written. And later, perhaps centuries later, in the next generation of followers of the prophet Isaiah, arose someone who understood Isaiah's message so well and was respected by his own contemporaries that someone listening to him might say, "This man is like a second Isaiah." And this later follower of the first Isaiah expounds the original message so fluently that it sounds as though Isaiah is still speaking. And as time passes, the sermons of this second Isaiah, I'm putting inverted commas around second Isaiah, but you may not have heard them. This second Isaiah's message gets added to the original Isaiah to make a longer and more contemporary book. Well, perhaps, as you may be able to tell from the way I'm imagining this, I'm not convinced. However, it has to be said in contemporary theological studies, mine is a minority position. So those that lecture in theology departments in many universities, those teaching A-level religious studies in schools, will deny the possibility of inspired predictive prophecy and replace it with some variation or other of a multiple author hypothesis. And if you want to read more, you will quite naturally try to buy or borrow a commentary on Isaiah, in which case you may well come across some of these ideas being worked out in print. Not that it necessarily makes a difference to our own interpretation. As John Goldingay puts it, critical commentaries assume that there were at least two Isaiahs, but preachers who believe in just one will only rarely find they have to dispute the understanding of particular passages because of this. Having mentioned John Goldingay, I should point out that his commentary on Isaiah in the Understanding the Bible series works on the assumption that there were multiple authors of the book of Isaiah. These include, in his opinion, the original prophet, whom Goldingay calls the ambassador, and later writers, which he describes as the disciple, the poet, and the preacher. But if you can filter out this aspect, the book is both readable and full of insight. But I'll say no more on this, as a discussion on the best commentaries to use when studying Isaiah is beyond my pay grade. However, something to think about, and this applies to many books in the Bible, is how they were written and possibly how they were compiled. Clearly, when Paul or James or anyone wrote a letter, either to a congregation or an individual, these were single documents, perhaps written in one sitting or over a short period of time. But when we look at some of the longer Old Testament books that cover a significant period of time, lifetimes even, in some of the historical books, such as Kings and Chronicles, it's reasonable to ask whether one author wrote the whole thing, or an editor brought together various documents or collected remembered stories from different sources and shaped them under inspiration into the document we read today. I think it's much more helpful to study the documents we have rather than speculate on how they came to be written. And as we move deeper into the time between the Testaments, we have little by way of biblical material. Some prophecies, such as Daniel's interpretation of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream concerning a statue, and Isaiah's references to Cyrus. But beyond these, we will need to turn to secular history to span the centuries, or look at the New Testament world and ask how it had been shaped. For example, we do not have to read far into the Gospels to see that there was a functioning temple in Jerusalem. Was this the one rebuilt during the ministries of Haggai and Zechariah, or a different one? And Jerusalem was under the control of the Roman Empire. Where did that come into the story? Certainly not in Old Testament times. So let's get back to our brief look at the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. One could say that Persia had more history than could be consumed locally. Western historians used to concentrate on the points at which Persia collided with Greece. Biblical historians concentrate on the Persian dealings with the chosen people. No doubt Iranian historians find something different to write about. On the principle of playing to my strengths, I will concentrate on the Persians and the Hebrews. I've already mentioned Cyrus, sometimes known as the Great, son of Cambyses I, or to give him his name in its Persian form, Kurash, a descendant of Tespes. Round about 557 BC, Cyrus became king of Anshan in Persia under the sovereignty of the king of the Medes. But between 550 and 539, still BC, remember, Cyrus conquered the Medes, Sardis and Lydia in Asia Minor, and finally Babylon. Having conquered Babylon, the city, and the territory ruled by the Babylonians, including Judah, Cyrus inherited a significant Jewish population. Not just Jews, of course, but the Jews had stuck together more cohesively than some of the other nations taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And of course, we can read about the Jewish response to living under Persian rule in the later books of the Old Testament. There's a key piece of evidence unearthed in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 by an employee of the British Museum named Hormuzd Rassam. A cylinder made of baked clay about 9 inches long, that's 23 centimeters in metric, covered in cuneiform writing. It is Persian propaganda telling how Cyrus captured Babylon without a battle. Then he states how he put right the evil done by the Babylonians by sending prisoners back to their own lands. He also boasted about how he aided the restoration of their temples and gave back their statues and other temple goods. While the cylinder does not explicitly mention Israel or the Jews, it does correspond to what we know from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And if you do not believe me, you can go and see it in the British Museum. Of course, it was not an easy ride for those Hebrews that chose to return to Judah. Jerusalem had been trashed by the Babylonians, and while many Jews were taken away, the Babylonians had not repopulated with new settlers. Instead, the Babylonians had allowed the remaining peasants to take whatever land they needed, which of course led to problems when the original owners or their descendants moved back. It was a long journey with no certainty of a happy ending, so many Hebrew exiles preferred to stay put in and around Babylon. This marks the start of the two streams of Judaism which lasts into the New Testament period and beyond. Diaspora Jews, living wherever they could find work and make a home, and Palestinian Jews who'd returned home and lived in and around Jerusalem. Palestinian Jews could and did worship in the temple. Diaspora Jews were synagogue Jews with a hope, not always realized, of making a pilgrimage back to Jerusalem when possible, which for many meant never. One Old Testament book that is set deep within the Persian Empire in and around Susa, one of the royal capitals, is the Book of Esther. The story is set during the reign of Xerxes, which is the anglicized form of the Hebrew version of the Greek name Ahasuerus, which is a translation of the Persian Kashayashan. Take that, spell checker. So around 486 to 465 BC or thereabouts. Now is not the time to explore the historicity of this wonderful book. Some scholars believe that Esther is an exercise in pious wish fulfillment, first told to give hope to oppressed Jews struggling to keep their religious and cultural identity alive while living in the Persian Empire. However, as we saw earlier in our very short look at whether predictive prophecy can happen, it all depends on our view of God. Could God raise up a good Hebrew girl to become wife of the Shah of Persia? Of course he could. And like many a good story, while there are moments when we can hardly believe what is happening, there's nothing about it which we must say that could not have happened. It is impossible. I remember reading somewhere, it sounds like it might have been G.K. Chesterton, but I can't find the actual quote. Fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. In the Book of Esther, a faithful Jewish girl uses her position as the wife of Shah Kashayashan to save the Jewish people from a threatened Holocaust about to be unleashed by a nasty piece of work named Haman. How Esther, previously known as Hadassah, got to be in just the right place at just the right time to do this is either yet another example of God guiding history or a chain of remarkable coincidences. Personally, I do not believe in coincidences, but I do believe in God. Our understanding of the Book of Esther is made more difficult by the fact that it exists in two versions. The original Hebrew text is unique in the Jewish scriptures in not explicitly using the name of God anywhere in its 10 chapters, although some clever people claim to have found his name encoded in the book, if you count the right number of letters. As I've not yet got around to learning Hebrew, I'm unable to check, so I merely pass on this possibility for you to do with what you like. Of course, anyone can see that God is at work throughout Esther's life, and perhaps only those without any imagination need to have it explained to them. However, at some point in the time between the Testaments, someone took matters into their own hands and wrote an expanded version of the Book of Esther, in which God is named and some other events are expanded upon. This was written in Greek and was a part of the project to translate the Hebrew scriptures for the great library at Alexandria. The tradition grew up that 70 scholars had laboured for 70 days to complete the translation, which was always known as the Septuagint and given the abbreviation of LXX, which is 70 in Latin, 50 plus 10 plus 10. You do the maths. And it was this edition of the scriptures that was used by the scholar and translator Jerome, or Hieronymus if you prefer, when he made the first great Latin Bible in the popular or Vulgate language of the time. This is the text that forms the basis of Roman Catholic Bibles, and so the expanded Greek version of the Book of Esther is to be found in Catholic translations such as the Jerusalem Bible and the Catholic editions of the Revised Standard Version, amongst others. Books that in Protestant Bibles are either ignored or kept in a separate category known as the Apocrypha, meaning hidden. The other designation being deuterocanonical, meaning later or secondary additions to the canon of Scripture. www.biblegateway.com includes Catholic editions if you want to browse online before deciding whether you need to buy a copy. Quick answer, no, you don't need a Bible with an Apocrypha, and although you may find it useful in historical research, it does not tell us anything we need to know for our salvation. I do not wish to spend any longer examining the Septuagint Bible in this session, but fear not, Patrick will lead a special study on this nearer the end of term on a Thursday when I'm unavailable. Whether we read Hebrew Esther or Greek Esther, the story remains the same. The Persian emperor holds a big party. As part of the entertainment, he orders his wife, Vashti, to appear. She refuses. Feminist readers of the Bible cheer at this point, appalled at the precedent of wives refusing to obey their husbands. Shahshan's noblemen persuade him to divorce Vashti and to pass a law that wives must obey their husbands. Like that's ever going to work. Anyway, Vashti is dismissed and a national beauty contest is arranged to find a suitable replacement. In his imaginative retelling of the story, Rob Lacey puts it like this. In the fortress city of Susa, there's a Jew from Benjamin's tribe called Mordecai Gerson. Mordecai's one of those carted off with King Jehoiachin of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, when he blew the Jerusalem defences away and strolled in. Mordecai's got a cousin called Hadassah, also known as Esther. She's an orphan, and he's brought her up like a daughter. The girl's an absolute stonker, a babe among babes. This babe among babes wins the beauty contest and becomes the latest of Shahshan's wives. Meanwhile, one of the emperor's noblemen, Haman, has taken a dislike to Esther's uncle Mordecai. By the way, I'm never sure whether it's pronounced Mordecai or Mordecai. You take your pick. As I said, I don't do Hebrew. Mordecai had refused to bow to Haman. Shades of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar's statue. So Haman starts work on a cunning plan to annihilate all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Hitler and his Nazis were not the first to try to obliterate the Jews. Haman's plot fails, and he gets his comeuppance and is hanged on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. This outline does not do justice to what is a beautifully constructed piece of storytelling, so read it for yourself later. Esther's story also gives the origin of the festival of Purim, or lots, from the fact that Haman cast lots to decide the date of his proposed massacre of the Jews. Purim is a joyful occasion, with the story of Esther being retold, sometimes even acted out, with cheers for the good guys and boos for Haman, and everyone eventually getting their just desserts. Oh, yes, they do. But did it happen? Historians and archaeologists have pointed out that the Persian background is authentic. There was a gate at Susa, and even the name Marduka, which might be the Persian form of Mordecai, has been found. Of course, the possibility that someone named Marduka once passed through a gate at Susa is not on its own corroboration of the Book of Esther, but it does suggest that at least parts of the story are authentic. Those that want to believe will be encouraged, and those that want to doubt will be dismissive, the same as it ever was. In general, the Medes and the Persians were relatively tolerant towards the conquered nations that made up their empire. Some nations conquered by the Medes and Persians, either singularly or combined, and other nations that came under Persian rule by dint of being defeated by a power that the Persians later defeated themselves, such as the Hebrews, who came to be part of the Persian Empire because the Persians defeated the Babylonians, who had defeated Judah. As seen in the Cyrus cylinder and other contemporary documents, the Persians usually had no objection if their subjects wanted to move back to wherever their ancestors had been taken from. We see this in action in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Pedantically, just one book in the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Ezra, which included the contents of the book of Nehemiah under the same title. Same contents, just no break between Ezra 10:44 and Nehemiah 1:1. And yes, I had to look up the Ezra reference, but not the fact that Nehemiah starts with chapter 1, verse 1. Incidentally, combining the two into one and naming it for Ezra reminds us just how important Ezra the scribe came to be considered by the Jews of the intertestamental period and beyond, sometimes referring to Ezra as the second Moses. High praise. There was trouble during the reign of Artaxerxes II, 359 to 338 BC. The city of Sidon revolted, soon supported by the inhabitants of Cyprus. The Sidonians brought in 4,000 Greek mercenaries from Egypt and took the Persians some time to quell the disturbance. Quite possibly other neighbouring people joined in the rebellion, and some records tell us that Artaxerxes deported a considerable number of Jews to Hyrcania, a region to the south of the Caspian Sea. Whether these Hebrews were taken from in and around Jerusalem or from elsewhere within Artaxerxes' kingdom is not made clear, but it does give us another significant Jewish population a long way from Palestine. Indeed, from the Persian period onwards, it seems more than likely that there were always more Jews living away from Palestine than within their traditional homeland, as remains the case to this day. A quick reminder about some of these significant differences between Palestinian Judaism and diaspora Judaism, or at least so far as we can tell from the available data. Starting by looking at my own community, the smallest village in rural Buckinghamshire. I know of 3 villagers who identify as Jewish, although, so far as I'm aware, they do not attend synagogue on a regular basis. Indeed, to do so from where we are would mean breaking Sabbath rules about the distance that may be travelled on a Sabbath. I do not know any of them well, but I guess the only Jewish aspect of their daily living is not eating pork, and none of the 3 have what are generally considered to be Christian first names, but I do not know them well enough to draw any conclusions. I expect they tick the Jewish box on census forms, and perhaps they plan for a Jewish funeral when the time comes. My point being, unless you knew these individuals well enough for them to tell you that they were Jewish, albeit non-observant, you would not know. Now, take this contemporary illustration back into the time between the Testaments. Were there Jews scattered around the ancient world who considered themselves Jewish, but who kept such a low profile that no one else knew? And how long would it take before they or their descendants lost their religious identity? Sociologists tell us that the last cultural marker that minority groups lose is their diet. So non-observant and lapsed Jews still do not eat pork. I remember a conversation while I was a student at Exeter. I was talking with a Messianic Jew who told me that his family, all Christian believers, still did not eat pork. They all knew they could, but somehow or other it did not appeal, and he confided he didn't know if his wife would know how to cook a pork chop. This was a long time ago. And he went on, she was happy to eat shellfish, but he still couldn't bring himself to try. How typical this individual was, I do not know, but I can imagine post-Jewish families around the world who would not touch pork, even though it's no longer a religious matter. It's much easier to keep to a religious diet when you're living amongst co-religionists. If your meat has to be slaughtered in a particular way by a qualified person, then if you're the only Jewish family in your village, either you eat non-kosher meat, the technical term is treif, or you follow the example of Daniel and his companions and become vegetarian. Likewise, what you wear. You may have noticed Orthodox Jews on your travels, perhaps even in your own locality. I often see Orthodox Jews at Euston Station in London, which is where I catch my train home if I visited the capital, and it's on the way back to the Jewish communities of northwest London, suburbs such as Golders Green and Hendon, where there's a significant Orthodox minority. Orthodox men are more often than not bearded and wear a broad-brimmed black hat. Orthodox women usually wear a long dress and often have a head covering, at least in a railway station. I've no idea what they wear when they get home. In times of persecution, Orthodox Jews stand out. In the time between the Testaments and beyond, some Jews wore the talit and tefillin, prayer shawl, and phylacteries, little boxes containing scrolls of parchment with verses of the law written on them. These act as a public reminder to pray and observe the law of Moses. So, back to the differences between Palestinian and diaspora Judaism in the time between the Testaments. Throughout this period, with one brief but significant interruption that we'll look at another day, there was a functioning temple in Jerusalem, not so grand as Solomon's original version, and not so spectacular as Herod's remodeling in the last years BC, that caused the disciples of Jesus to gasp in amazement, "Master, what a building! Look at the size of it!" So throughout the time between the Testaments, priests of the family of Aaron, assisted by Levites, kept the cycle of sacrifices going in Jerusalem, which was, no doubt, a matter of pride and religious satisfaction for the Jerusalemite Jews and those in the nearby towns of Judah. And perhaps Jews from further afield took comfort in the fact that the Lord was in his holy temple, even if they would never or only very rarely get to visit for themselves. But the sacrificial system continued in Jerusalem and possibly elsewhere. We've mentioned the shrine at Elephantine in Egypt, and there are suggestions that sacrifices were offered at some synagogues around the diaspora, although the locals may not have shared this information with all and sundry in case the priests at Jerusalem heard about them and told them to stop, as was the case at Elephantine. For diaspora Jews, worship became centered on the synagogue. This was basically a meeting room, and once any scrolls were removed, it becomes hard for archaeologists to identify an ancient synagogue, even if they're looking for them. A synagogue service was much simpler than the ceremonies of the temple, led by a rabbi, a teacher, who was not a priest and may not even have been a Levite. The Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, were read in Hebrew and psalms were sung. Worship became an offering of study and praise rather than animal sacrifice. And there was perhaps a tendency to present the faith as a matter of ritual, a different ritual to what happened in the temple, but nonetheless a ritual. Certain psalms were sung on certain days. There was a set passage of scripture to be read and then expounded. So every Sabbath became the same old, and it becomes easy to see how some of the problems associated with Phariseeism took root, as we see from reading the Gospels. This is as far as I want to go in the Old Testament. We are, after all, meant to be looking at the time between the Testaments. What I want to suggest to you is that much of what happened to the chosen people after Malachi and before Matthew is rooted in the back end of the Old Testament. Those last chapters of Kings and Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, some of the prophetic books, and also Esther. When we take this information and project it forward, we can see themes that will continue across the centuries. We will do something similar when we take New Testament material and use it as a lens as we look at the time between the Testaments from the other side of the gap. Lord willing, next session we will meet one of the most remarkable men of his time, Alexander II of Macedon, sometimes known as the Great. Before then, if you have time to read the book of Esther in a modern translation, that would be worthwhile. And make a note to visit the British Museum. It might not be practical to go in the next 7 days, but next time you're passing, go and look at the Cyrus cylinder. However, a word to the wise: never plan a visit to the British Museum to see a specific object without first checking that it will be on view. Sometimes objects are removed for conservation. Sometimes they're loaned out to other museums, and not all galleries in the museum are open to visitors on every day that the museum is open. So check first. And if getting to the BM is a challenge, you can see a lot online. www.britishmuseum.org is worth a look, and its search facility is easy to navigate. So why not pay a virtual visit and find out more about the Cyrus cylinder? Thank you. We'll pause for a moment and close with a prayer, and then we can open up any chats and check on anything else that's happening in the British Bible School in the coming days. Lots of stuff on the British Bible School website and Facebook page, and check out the diary. And something that, if the archaeological part of the history that we were looking at tonight, if this interests you, there was a special Saturday lecture a little while ago now, presented by Patrick, fully illustrated, The Bible in the British Museum, and that's now available on the Bible School YouTube channel. So you can search for that, and if you can't find it, drop Patrick a note and he can send you the link